When Japanese intelligence officers first circulated reconnaissance photographs of the F6F Hellcat in early 1943, the response in Imperial Navy ready rooms was almost unanimous laughter. Veteran Zero pilots, men who had dominated the skies over Pearl Harbor, the Philippines, and the Coral Sea, gathered around the grainy images with expressions ranging from amusement to outright mockery. "Look at this fat American pig," one ace remarked, tracing his finger along the Hellcat's bulbous cowling and thick wings. The aircraft seemed to violate every principle of fighter design that had made the Zero legendary. It was heavy where the Zero was light, brutish where the Zero was elegant, crude where the Zero was refined. Compared to the graceful lines of the A6M, with its slender fuselage, delicate wings, and minimal weight, the Hellcat looked like a flying bathtub, an ungainly collection of armor plates and oversized components held together by American industrial excess. "They still don't understand air combat," a flight instructor at Yokosuka told his students, tapping the photograph dismissively. "Speed and firepower mean nothing without maneuverability. The Zero will dance circles around this. What do they call it? Hellcat." The name itself seemed absurd, aggressive and boastful in the typical American style, attached to an aircraft that appeared more suited to ground attack than fighter versus fighter combat. The mockery was rooted in genuine battlefield success and a fundamental misunderstanding of American design philosophy. For nearly 2 years, Japanese pilots had carved through every fighter the Americans threw at them. The Brewster Buffalo had been a joke, shot down in droves during the opening months of war. The P-39-era Cobra proved hopelessly outmatched at the altitudes where Pacific combat occurred. Even the scrappy F-4F Wildcat, despite occasional victories by skilled pilots, suffered terrible losses in turning engagements with Zeros. Japanese tactical doctrine emphasized the turning dogfight, vertical spiral climbs, tight horizontal turns, knife-edge maneuvers that allowed the Zero's superior agility to shine. Their pilots trained for years, becoming artists of aerobatic combat, confident that no American fighter could match their skill or their aircraft's performance. So when the Hellcat appeared, visibly heavier, obviously more complex, burdened with what looked like unnecessary armor and equipment, the Japanese saw confirmation of everything they already believed. Americans built tanks, not fighters. They compensated for inferior pilot skill with crude mechanical advantages. They would learn, eventually, that elegance beats brute force. What the laughing Japanese pilots couldn't see in those reconnaissance photos were the lessons written in blood. Grumman's engineers had interviewed every surviving Wildcat pilot who'd faced Zeros. They'd studied gun camera footage frame by frame. They'd examined wreckage of shot-down American fighters and catalogued exactly how they died. The Hellcat wasn't designed to outturn the Zero. That was impossible given the physics of weight and wing loading. Instead, it was designed to refuse the turning fight entirely, to kill Zeros from positions of advantage and survive when caught at disadvantage. Every pound of unnecessary weight served a brutal purpose: armor to stop 20mm cannon shells, self-sealing fuel tanks to prevent the catastrophic fires that killed so many American pilots, a massive 2,000 horsepower engine to enable dive-away escapes and boom-and-zoom attacks. The Japanese saw a fat, slow fighter. Grumman had built a flying fortress designed specifically to slaughter Zeros while bringing American pilots home alive. The joke, though nobody in those Japanese ready rooms realized it yet, was about to be on them. The conference room at Grumman's Bethpage facility was thick with cigarette smoke and tension as lead engineer Bill Schwendler stood before a chalkboard covered in calculations, weight distributions, and performance curves. The assembled group, Navy procurement officers, test pilots, and senior designers, had been arguing for 3 hours about the fundamental question that would define the Hellcat. What kind of fighter does the Pacific War actually need? Traditional doctrine said fighters should prioritize speed, climb rate, and maneuverability above all else, the characteristics that allowed pilots to outposition enemies and dominate dogfights. But Schwendler had different data in front of him. Combat loss reports from the first 18 months of Pacific fighting, showing American fighters shot down at ratios that ranged from alarming to catastrophic. Wildcat pilots reported that 0.20mm cannons punched through their aircraft like paper, that single hits often caused fewer fires, that the lightweight American fighters disintegrated under battle damage that Japanese aircraft survived. "We can't outturn them," Schwendler said flatly, erasing a section of calculations and writing 3 words in chalk: speed, armor, firepower. The Zero has half-hour wing loading and 2 years of combat experience pilots. Any attempt to match their maneuverability means building a lightweight fighter, which means our pilots burn to death when they get hit. We need to change the equation entirely. He outlined a radical philosophy: build a fighter heavy enough to absorb punishment, fast enough to control engagement parameters, and armed heavily enough to destroy enemies in short bursts. The Navy representatives looked skeptical. This sounded like defensive thinking, and America needed offensive weapons to take back the Pacific. But Schwendler's logic was ruthlessly mathematical, and it won the argument. The Hellcat that emerged from Grumman's design process was revolutionary precisely because it rejected fighter aviation's sacred cows. Thick armor plates surrounded the cockpit, not aluminum, but genuine steel capable of stopping Japanese cannon shells. Self-sealing fuel tanks lined with layers of rubber compounds would close automatically when punctured, preventing the nightmare of fire that haunted every American pilot who'd seen friends burn to death in disintegrating Wildcats. August 31, 1943, dawned clear and hot over Task Force 15 as it approached Marcus Island, a tiny speck of coral and concrete in the vast Pacific where Japanese forces maintained a radar station and small air garrison. This was it, the moment the Hellcat would face the Zero in actual combat, not in carefully controlled tests or theoretical discussions, but in the chaotic violence of aerial warfare where reputations were built or destroyed in seconds. VF-5 Squadron launched from USS Yorktown's deck with 12 F6F Hellcats, their blue-grey paint still factory fresh, their pilots a mix of Wildcat veterans and recent flight school graduates with fewer than 50 combat hours. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare led the formation, already legendary for earning the Medal of Honor defending Lexington in a Wildcat, already skeptical about any fighter that sacrificed maneuverability for armor. The pre-flight briefing had been explicit and drilled into every pilot until they could recite it in their sleep: stay in pairs, maintain altitude and speed advantage, use the thatch-weave defensive scissor if engaged, execute boom and zoom attacks exclusively, and under no circumstances, none, get into a sustained turning fight with a Zero. Your aircraft is faster in a dive and climb, O'Hare had told his pilots, his voice carrying the weight of hard experience. Use that. Dive, shoot, climb away. The Zero turns better, so don't turn. It's that simple. Simple in theory, but every pilot knew the reality. When someone's shooting at you, instinct screams to turn into the threat, and that instinct had killed many American pilots. Japanese radar detected the incoming raid and scrambled 18 Zeros from Marcus Island's dusty airstrip, their pilots confident and experienced, climbing rapidly into defensive positions above their base. The Zero commander ordered standard interception tactics that had worked Brill Ally for 2 years: climb to altitude advantage, dive through the American formation to scatter them and create chaos, then separate the Americans and destroy them individually in turning dogfights where Zero superiority was absolute. As the two formations closed, O'Hare spotted the climbing Zeros at 2 o'clock high and made the critical decision: maintain altitude and speed, let them commit to their dive, then counterattack from the energy advantage. The Zeros dove as expected, a stream of graceful fighters plunging through the Hellcat formation with guns blazing, but the Hellcats didn't scatter. They maintained formation, absorbed the attack, and then O'Hare called the counter: break left, Chandelle, engage. The Hellcats split into pairs, using their superior speed to climb back to altitude while the Zeros, committed to their dive and now below the Americans, tried to convert back to climbing attacks. Here the mathematics of energy combat became brutally clear. The Hellcats could dive faster, climb faster, and control the engagement geometry. O'Hare's wingman, Lieutenant J.G. Alex Vreeshuh, got the first kill, a Zero that tried to climb after the Hellcats and stalled in a vulnerable position. Vreeshuh's 6.50 calibers shredded it in a 2-second burst, the weight of fire literally sawing the lightweight Japanese fighter in half. Another Zero attempted the classic deflection shot during a turn, but the Hellcat pilot simply rolled into a dive, accelerated to 400 miles per hour, a speed the Zero couldn't match, and climbed back up behind his attacker. The battle lasted 12 minutes, and when it ended, VF5 had shot down 9 Zeros while losing 0 Hellcats. One F6F returned with 37 bullet and cannon holes, its armor having stopped shells that would have killed a Wildcat pilot, the aircraft repairable and flying again within 2 days. The Japanese pilots who survived, including the formation commander, radioed back reports that sounded almost panicked. The new American fighter refused a dogfight, absorbed damage that should have been fatal, and killed Zeros with shocking efficiency. O'Hare's post-mission report was more clinical but equally revolutionary. The F6F performed exactly as designed. Pilots maintained discipline, used energy tactics, and the aircraft's speed and firepower advantages proved decisive. Armor saved at least 2 pilots who would have been casualties in F4FS. Word of Marcus Island spread through both fleets like wildfire, among Americans with relief and growing confidence, among Japanese with the first cold stirrings of doubt about Zero invincibility and their own tactical assumptions about what fighter combat in the Pacific would look like going forward. By late 1943, Japanese pilots had stopped laughing about the Hellcat and started dreading it. The aircraft they dismissed as a fat American pig had become something far more terrifying, a systematic killer that exploited every weakness in Zero design and Japanese tactical doctrine with cold, mathematical precision. Combat after combat followed the same nightmare pattern for Japanese aviators. They would spot Hellcat formations, attempt their proven diving attacks, and find themselves caught in tactics they had no answer for. The Americans refused to dogfight, refused to follow Zeros into turning engagements, refused to fight on any terms except their own. Instead, Hellcat pairs employed the thatch weave, a scissoring defensive maneuver where 2 fighters covered each other's tails, making it nearly impossible for Zeros to achieve firing position without exposing themselves to the wingman's guns. When Hellcats attacked, they used pure energy tactics, dive from altitude, fire a devastating burst from 6.50 caliber machine guns, then climb away using their superior speed and power before Zeros could respond. Japanese pilots would instinctively turn to engage, but the Hellcats simply weren't there anymore, already climbing back to altitude, resetting for another attack. It was like fighting ghosts. One Zero pilot wrote in his diary, "They appear, they kill, they vanish. We turn to engage empty sky while they climb above us again. Our advantage in maneuver means nothing if we cannot force them to maneuver." The tactical revolution was devastating because it transformed the Zero's greatest strengths into fatal vulnerabilities. The lightweight construction that made Zero so agile also made them fragile. Hellcat .50 caliber rounds punched through aluminum skin, shredded control surfaces, and ignited fuel tanks that lacked proper sealing. The lack of armor that saved weight left pilots completely exposed to the Hellcat's firepower. Where Hellcats could absorb hits and keep fighting, a single burst often killed Zero pilots instantly or set their aircraft ablaze. The excellent low-speed handling that enabled tight turns became a trap when Hellcats simply refused to slow down, maintaining energy advantages that allowed them to dictate every engagement. Japanese formations that had once operated with arrogant confidence now flew defensively, constantly scanning above and behind for the diving Hellcats they knew were hunting them. Combat reports from late 1943 and early 1944 read like horror stories. Entire Japanese formations bounced by Hellcats and decimated in minutes. Veteran aces with dozens of kills shot down by American pilots with barely 50 flight hours. Desperate radio calls as Zero after Zero fell burning into the Pacific. The psychological impact was as destructive as the kill ratios. Japanese pilot training, already degraded by losses of experienced instructors, began teaching defensive tactics: how to evade rather than engage, how to survive rather than dominate. Flight schools that had once produced supremely confident aviators now graduated pilots who were already afraid, already convinced they were being sent to die against an enemy they couldn't beat. Intelligence officers compiled desperate reports analyzing Hellcat tactics and begging for countermeasures, but there were no easy answers. Building heavier, more survivable fighters would take years and resources Japan didn't have. Training pilots to match American teamwork and energy tactics required time the accelerating war wouldn't allow. The Zero, once the symbol of Japanese air superiority, had become a death trap flown by increasingly inexperienced pilots against an enemy that had solved the tactical equation completely. The Hellcat wasn't just winning, it was systematically destroying Japanese naval aviation's ability to fight, one ambush and one kill at a time. June 19, 1944, would be remembered as the day Japanese naval aviation died. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, later nicknamed the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot by gleeful American pilots, became the most one-sided aerial slaughter in military history, and the F6F Hellcat was the instrument of that slaughter. The Japanese had assembled their remaining carrier strength, 9 carriers with 430 aircraft, for a decisive battle to stop the American advance across the Pacific. Their plan was classic carrier doctrine: launch massive strikes to overwhelm American defenses, destroy the invasion fleet off Saipan, and restore Japanese control of the Central Pacific. Vice Admiral Jisaburo Ozawa believed his aircraft's superior range would allow him to strike American carriers before they could respond, achieving the devastating first blow that had worked so brilliantly at Pearl Harbor. What Ozawa couldn't know, was that American radar technology, fighter direction procedures, and above all the Hellcat's combat superiority had transformed carrier warfare into something unrecognizable from 1941. As Japanese strike packages launched and flew toward the American fleet, shipboard radar picked them up at enormous distances, plotting courses and altitudes with precision impossible 3 years earlier. Fighter direction officers vectored Hellcat combat air patrols to intercept points calculated to hit Japanese formations before they reached the fleet. The Japanese pilots, many with fewer than 6 months training replacing the experienced aviators lost at Midway and the Solomons, flew straight into a buzzsaw. The slaughter began at 10:30 a.m. when the first Japanese strike, 69 aircraft, encountered waves of Hellcats that had been positioned perfectly by radar guidance. The Americans dove through the Japanese formation with textbook precision, boom and zoom attacks that shredded bombers and torpedo planes, then energy tactics that picked apart the escorting Zeros trying desperately to protect their charges. Within 20 minutes, 42 Japanese aircraft were burning in the Pacific. The survivors who penetrated to the fleet faced a second nightmare: hundreds of anti-aircraft guns guided by radar fire control, creating walls of steel that destroyed most of the remaining attackers before they could drop weapons. Of the 69 aircraft in the first strike, only 27 returned to their carriers, and most bore damage. The second strike fared even worse. 130 aircraft launched into the teeth of waiting Hellcats that had been refueled, rearmed, and vectored by fighter directors who tracked every Japanese formation. Hellcat pilot Alex Vreeshu alone shot down 6 Japanese aircraft in 8 minutes, his gun camera footage showing one kill after another. Dive bombers exploding under .50 caliber fire, Zeros spinning out of control, torpedo planes cartwheeling into the sea. It was like an old-time turkey shoot back home, Vreeshu told reporters afterward, and the name stuck. By day's end, the Japanese had launched 4 major strikes totaling 373 aircraft. American Hellcats and anti-aircraft fire destroyed 243 of them, a staggering 65% loss rate that effectively ended Japanese carrier aviation as an effective fighting force. The Americans lost 29 aircraft, most to operational accidents rather than enemy action. The kill ratio was approximately 19-1 in favor of the Hellcat, a number so lopsided it seemed impossible, yet the gun camera footage and wreckage counts confirmed it. In the ready rooms of American carriers that evening, pilots were almost giddy with the scale of their victory, chalking up kills, comparing stories, celebrating what many recognized as the decisive naval-air battle of the Pacific War. On the surviving Japanese carriers limping westward, the mood was funeral. Azores 9 carriers now held fewer than 100 operational aircraft, most flown by pilots so shaken they were barely functional. Squadron commanders wrote reports that read like eulogies. Entire formations wiped out, experienced flight leaders dead, rookie pilots who panicked and died without ever engaging effectively. One Japanese officer's diary entry captured the desperation. The Americans have created a fighter we cannot counter and tactics we cannot defeat. Our pilots are brave but die uselessly. The Hellcat owns the sky, and we are simply targets. The Great Marianas Turkey Shoot didn't just defeat a Japanese naval force. It demonstrated that the Americans had achieved such complete tactical and technological superiority that Japanese naval aviation could no longer contest American carrier operations in any meaningful way. The Hellcat didn't just win battles, it created legends. Between 1943 and 1945, more American pilots became aces flying the F6F than any other aircraft in history, a testament to both the fighter's capability and the target-rich environment of the Pacific War. David McCampbell, the Navy's top ace, scored 34 kills in his Hellcat, including a single mission where he shot down 9 Japanese aircraft in one day during the Battle of Leyte Gulf. His aircraft, named Mincer 3, bore row after row of kill markings by war's end, each Japanese flag representing a victory enabled by the Hellcat's perfect combination of firepower, protection, and performance. McCampbell's technique was classic energy fighting: maintain altitude advantage, identify the most dangerous threat, dive with tremendous speed, fire a short precise burst, then climb away before anyone could respond. "The Hellcat let me fight my way," he explained in post-war interviews. "I wasn't the world's best dogfighter, but I didn't need to be. I could outclimb anything Japanese, outdive anything they had, and my 650s could kill any aircraft in the Pacific with a 2-second burst." His success wasn't individual brilliance but systematic application of tactics the Hellcat enabled. Then there was Alex Vreeshu, whose 19 kills included the 6 he scored in 8 minutes during the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot, a feat of marksmanship and tactical positioning that made him famous throughout the fleet. Cecil Harris claimed 24 victories flying from various carriers, becoming known for aggressive attacks that pressed close enough to guarantee kills but exploited the Hellcat's armor to survive return fire that would have destroyed lighter fighters. Patrick Fleming scored 19 kills despite being shot down twice, once crash landing on a carrier deck with his Hellcat so damaged it was pushed overboard afterward, yet Fleming walked away with minor injuries thanks to the armored cockpit that kept him alive. The stories multiplied across dozens of squadrons: Cornelius Newey with 19 kills, Eugene Valencia with 23, Douglas Baker with 16. What united these aces wasn't superhuman ability but excellent training combined with an aircraft that forgave mistakes, protected pilots when they got hit, and killed efficiently when opportunity arose. The Hellcat's ease of maintenance meant these aces flew constantly, sortie after sortie, engagement after engagement, accumulating experience and kills in a way that would have been impossible in less reliable aircraft. Its strong construction meant they survived crashes and combat damage that killed pilots in more fragile fighters, staying alive to fight again. And its overwhelming firepower meant that when they got firing position, even briefly, the target usually died. Japanese pilots learned to recognize and fear certain Hellcats by their markings, knowing that some American pilots had become so experienced and lethal that engaging them was near certain death. Intelligence reports identified McCampbell's Mincer 3 and warned pilots to avoid it if possible, a remarkable admission that individual American pilots had become tactical considerations in Japanese planning. The ace makers weren't just skilled pilots, they were products of a system that combined excellent training, superior tactics, overwhelming industrial production, and an aircraft specifically designed to keep pilots alive long enough to become deadly. The Hellcat created aces not because it was the fastest or most maneuverable fighter, but because it kept Americans alive through their learning curve while giving them the tools to kill efficiently once they gained experience. By war's end, 305 Hellcat pilots had achieved A status with 5 or more kills, and the aircraft was credited with destroying 5,223 enemy aircraft, more than any other Allied fighter type. The Grumman Ironcat had become an ace-making machine, transforming average pilots into competent killers and competent pilots into legends. October 25, 1944, began like any other combat air patrol day for Lieutenant Bill Hardy and his Hellcat squadron orbiting above the invasion fleet off Letter Gulf. Then the radio exploded with frantic warnings. Many bogies inbound, bearing 270, Angels 5, closing fast. Hardy's stomach dropped as he scanned the horizon and saw them. 20 aircraft in ragged formation, all heading directly toward the carriers with no evasive maneuvers, no tactical positioning, just straight-line approaches that could mean only one thing. These weren't bombers trying to survive long enough to release weapons and escape. These were kamikazes, pilots who'd already written their final letters home and were now flying bombs aimed at American ships with suicidal determination. The mathematics of kamikaze defense were brutal and unforgiving. Every aircraft that penetrated the Hellcat screen had perhaps 30 seconds before reaching ship anti-aircraft range, and in those 30 seconds a single explosive-laden Zero or Val could crash into a carrier's deck and kill hundreds of sailors, cripple a ship worth millions, and eliminate a floating airfield that couldn't be replaced for months. Hardy rolled into a near-vertical dive, his wingman tucked in tight, both Hellcats accelerating past 400 miles per hour as they plummeted toward the incoming raid. "Take the lead, bomber," Hardy called, already lining up his gun sight on a Val dive bomber that was visibly loaded with a massive bomb slung beneath its fuselage. His 6.50 calibers roared for 2 seconds. The Val disintegrated in a fireball so violent that Hardy had to bank hard to avoid the debris cloud. His wingman got the second bomber. Other Hellcats from the cap dove into the formation like wolves into sheep, guns hammering, traces creating deadly streams through the air. But kamikazes didn't break formation when hit. Didn't evade. A Zero trailing smoke and flames kept flying straight toward the carriers until a second Hellcat burst literally sawed its wing off. A duty bomber with its engine on fire maintained course until it crashed into the sea just 500 yards from a destroyer. The 10-minute engagement was the most intense of Hardy's life, not because of tactical complexity or skilled opponents, but because of the desperate mathematics of interception where every miss was potentially catastrophic. His gun camera footage, reviewed later, showed him destroying 3 kamikazes in rapid succession. Dive on target, fire brief burst, pull up while target explodes, immediately acquire next target, repeat. No time for maneuvering or positioning or textbook tactics. Just point, shoot, kill, move to the next one. When the engagement ended, Hardy's squadron had destroyed 17 of the 20 attackers. 3 penetrated to the fleet, and Hardy watched in horror as one crashed into the escort carrier USS St. Lo, the explosion so massive it broke the ship in half and sent it to the bottom within 30 minutes. 114 sailors died in that attack. Men Hardy had never met but who were his responsibility to protect, and he'd failed them. "We won the engagement," he told the intelligence officer during debrief, his hands still shaking. "We killed 17. But those 3 that got through." He didn't finish the sentence. The kamikaze campaign that began in October 1944 and lasted through the war's end threw approximately 3,000 suicide aircraft at American fleets, and Hellcat pilots became the primary defenders against this terrifying tactic. The missions were exhausting. 6 or 7 sorties per day during major operations, constant scrambles, radar-vectored intercepts where every second mattered. Pilots flew until they could barely stay awake, knowing that any lapse in coverage could mean shipmates died. The psychological toll was immense. Unlike normal combat where you celebrated victories, kamikaze defense meant you only remembered failures. The ones that got through, the ships that burned, the sailors who died because you weren't quite fast enough or accurate enough. The Hellcat proved ideal for this desperate mission precisely because of characteristics that seemed pedestrian in normal combat. Its rugged reliability meant it could fly sortie after sortie with minimal maintenance when every available fighter needed to be airborne. Its heavy armament could destroy targets with brief firing passes, essential when engaging multiple kamikazes in rapid succession. Its armor protected pilots in close-range interceptions where damaged kamikazes still had enough control to fire back. Statistics from the Okinawa campaign, the peak of kamikaze operations, showed that Hellcats and other fighters destroyed approximately 74% of kamikaze aircraft before they reached ship defenses, an interception rate that prevented catastrophic fleet losses despite the Japanese throwing 1,900 suicide aircraft at American forces over 3 months. One Hellcat pilot, interviewed after flying 9 sorties in a single day intercepting kamikaze raids, was asked about his 6 kills. He looked at the reporter with exhausted, haunted eyes and said, "Don't congratulate me. Ask me about the 2 that I missed. The ones that hit USS Bunker Hill and killed 400 guys. Those are the ones I remember. Those are the ones I'll always remember." The kamikaze wall wasn't a glorious mission or a source of A status. It was grim, desperate defensive work where success meant preventing disaster rather than achieving victory, and the Hellcat pilots who flew it paid psychological prices that lasted long after the war ended. The ground crew chief ran his hand along the damaged Hellcat's fuselage, counting bullet holes while shaking his head in disbelief. 37 hits. 7 20mm cannon strikes. 1 round had penetrated the cockpit and lodged in the armor plate directly behind the pilot seat. Another had shattered the canopy, showering the pilot with glass fragments. A third had destroyed the starboard aileron, forcing the pilot to land with mismatched control surfaces and a prayer. And yet the aircraft had flown 200 miles back to the carrier, landed successfully, and the pilot had walked away with minor cuts. "Sir," the chief said to the squadron commander inspecting the damage, "in a Zero or a Wildcat, this pilot would be dead 5 times over." The commander nodded, running his own hand over the armor plating that had stopped the cockpit round. "That's why we fly Hellcats," he said simply. This scene repeated across the Pacific Theater throughout 1944 and 1945. Hellcats absorbing damage that would have destroyed any other fighter, bringing pilots home alive, and returning to combat after repairs that would have sent lesser aircraft to the scrap heap. The Iron Cat nickname wasn't propaganda. It was simple recognition that Grumman had built a fighter that could take punishment and keep fighting. The engineering that enabled this survivability was sophisticated and deliberate. The R2800 engine was famously robust, capable of running with 1 or 2 cylinders shot out, oil lines severed, and cooling systems damaged. Pilots reported limping home on engines that by all rights should have seized, the massive radial somehow continuing to turn despite damage that would have killed inline engines instantly. The self-sealing fuel tanks, layers of rubber compounds that swelled when punctured by bullets, prevented the catastrophic fires that killed so many Japanese pilots flying Zeros with unprotected tanks. Combat footage showed Zeros exploding from single hits while Hellcats absorbed multiple cannon strikes and continued fighting, the fuel system containing leaks and preventing ignition. The armor protection was comprehensive. Steel plates behind the pilot's head and back, armored glass windscreen, protection for critical control runs and systems. Japanese 7.7mm machine gun rounds, lethal against Zeros, simply bounced off Hellcat armor. Even 20mm cannon strikes, while damaging, often failed to penetrate to vital components or the pilot. The airframe itself was overbuilt by fighter standards, with redundant structural elements and thick skin that could absorb battle damage without catastrophic failure. Wings stayed attached when they should have separated. Control surfaces remained functional when riddled with holes. Landing gear extended despite hydraulic damage. The firepower advantage was equally overwhelming. 6 Browning M2.50 caliber machine guns, each fed by 400 rounds, created a cone of destruction that no Japanese aircraft could survive. The heavy bullets punched through Zero aluminum like tissue paper, shredded control surfaces, destroyed engines, and killed pilots. Hellcat pilots learned to fire short bursts, 1 or 2 seconds, because longer firing was simply wasteful. The target would already be destroyed, tumbling in flames or disintegrating in mid-air. Gun camera footage from Hellcat kills showed the devastating effect: a brief flash of tracer, then the target aircraft literally coming apart, wings folding, fuselage breaking, fires erupting. Japanese pilots who survived Hellcat attacks reported that being hit felt like flying into an invisible wall of steel. One captured aviator, his Zero shot to pieces by a Hellcat's brief burst, described the experience. "I heard a sound like hail on a metal roof. My instruments exploded. My windscreen shattered. Pieces of my aircraft peeled away. Then flames. All of this in perhaps 1 second. I barely escaped before it exploded." The combination of survivability and firepower created a combat multiplier that statistics only partially captured. Hellcat pilots could press attacks more aggressively, knowing their armor would protect them from return fire. They could stay in combat longer, confident their aircraft would bring them home despite damage. They could accept riskier firing positions because their 6.50 calibers needed only a brief window to kill. The psychological advantage was immense. Hellcat pilots fought with confidence while Japanese pilots flew in fear, and that confidence translated directly into combat effectiveness and kill ratios that seemed impossible until you understood the engineering advantages Grumman had built into every rivet and plate of their fortress fighter. February 17, 1944, the sun was setting over Truk Lagoon, Japan's Gibraltar of the Pacific, as the final waves of American aircraft completed one of the most devastating carrier raids in naval history. For 2 days, Task Force 58 had pounded the massive Japanese base with hundreds of sorties, sinking ships, destroying aircraft, and reducing shore installations to rubble. Now, in the fading golden light, Hellcats from VF6 flew one last sweep over the burning lagoon, hunting for any remaining Japanese aircraft attempting to escape or counterattack. Lieutenant Commander Edward "Butch" O'Hare, the Medal of Honor recipient who'd helped prove the Hellcat at Marcus Island, led the twilight patrol, his aircraft silhouetted against orange and purple clouds. The scene below was apocalyptic: dozens of Japanese ships burning or sinking, black smoke columns rising thousands of feet, secondary explosions lighting the darkening water, and the wreckage of nearly 300 destroyed Japanese aircraft scattered across Truk's airfields. This was the kind of overwhelming American power that would have seemed impossible in 1942, but by 1944 had become routine. Carrier task forces striking with impunity deep into Japanese-held territory, their Hellcats sweeping enemy aircraft from the sky and their bombers destroying everything below. O'Hare's radar operator called out a contact, a single aircraft, low, attempting to escape westward in the gathering darkness. The Hellcat formation turned to intercept, diving through layers of smoke-tinged clouds toward the fleeing target. The engagement that followed became one of the Pacific War's tragedies, a confused night interception where O'Hare's aircraft was hit by friendly fire from a U.S. bomber's gunner and crashed into the lagoon, killing the ace whose leadership had helped transform carrier aviation. But even as the Navy mourned one of its heroes, the strategic implications of operations like Truk were undeniable. American carrier forces now operated with such dominance that they could strike Japan's most heavily defended bases, destroy everything of value, and withdraw with acceptable losses. The Hellcat had made this possible by achieving the air superiority that allowed bombers to work unmolested and ships to operate without fear of Japanese air attack. In the months following Truk, the pattern repeated across the Pacific. American carriers would appear off Japanese-held islands, Hellcats would establish total air superiority within hours, and bombers would methodically destroy infrastructure while suffering minimal losses. Palau, Hollandia, Formosa, the Philippines. Each operation followed the same template of Hellcat-enabled dominance. The twilight patrols became almost melancholy for American pilots. Instead of desperate battles for survival, they flew over burning enemy bases with nothing left to fight, the sun setting on Japanese positions that would never recover. Japanese commanders watching these raids understood the strategic implications perfectly. If American carriers could strike anywhere with impunity, no position was safe, no garrison could be reinforced, no island could be held. The Hellcat had become the symbol of this unstoppable advance, not through individual heroics or dramatic dogfights, but through systematic, overwhelming, boring dominance. Pilots who'd expected the romance of aerial combat instead found themselves flying patrol after patrol over uncontested airspace, occasionally bouncing a fleeing Japanese aircraft, mostly just maintaining coverage while bombers did their work. "It's not what I imagined when I joined," one pilot wrote home. "We are not fighting for the sky anymore. We own it. The Japanese barely come up to challenge us. It feels less like combat and more like extermination." That grim assessment captured the reality of late-war Pacific operations. The Hellcat had so completely solved the fighter combat problem that Japanese aviation was effectively non-existent over any area American carriers chose to dominate. The dusk patrols over burning Japanese bases became almost ceremonial, a final sweep to confirm there was nothing left to destroy, that American control was absolute, that the advance would continue tomorrow toward the next target. The sun set over Truk Lagoon that February evening on a Japanese base that would never function again, its aircraft destroyed, its ship sunk, its defenses shattered, and above it all, Hellcats circled in the fading light, unchallenged and supreme. The true measure of the Hellcat's success lay not just in its devastating kill count, but in its ability to systematically dismantle the core myth of Japanese air invincibility. For years, the legend of the A6M Zero, the nimble, graceful, and deadly fighter flown by the sons of heaven, had been an essential component of Japanese military morale and public propaganda. Early reconnaissance photographs of the bulky F6F were openly mocked in Japanese ready rooms, providing confirmation bias for a military establishment that believed Japanese spiritual strength and elegant design would always triumph over crude American industrial output. This dismissal was swiftly amplified by government propaganda, which continually inflated American losses while concealing the catastrophic realities of combat. However, the Hellcat quickly became a myth destroyer by delivering tactical results that could not be explained away. Beginning with its debut at Marcus Island and accelerating through engagements at Rabaul and Bougainville, Hellcat pilots returned with gun camera film showing Zeros exploding from brief bursts and enemy aircraft refusing to be drawn into dogfights. The reality faced by Japanese pilots, that the American fighter was faster, could climb better, and, most critically, could not be killed with the same ease as previous American models, was a devastating psychological blow. The contradiction between the state-controlled narrative and the battlefield truth reached a crisis point in 1944. Official American figures detailing the Hellcat's kill ratios, initially $/math 5 to 1, then $/math 8 to 1, and peaking at $/math 19 to 1, during the Marianas Turkey shoot, were catastrophic evidence of the Zero's fatal obsolescence. While the public was shown stylized posters of Zeros dominating the skies, internal Japanese intelligence reports painted a picture of utter despair, entire veteran squadrons wiped out in minutes, and new pilots dying before they could even gain minimal experience. The psychological warfare of the Hellcat was immense. The Japanese had built a fighter that prioritized defense at the expense of the pilot. The Americans built the Hellcat on the principle of pilot survivability above all else. The fact that a Hellcat pilot could absorb multiple cannon hits and still return home to fight again, while the Zero disintegrated from a single burst, confirmed to both sides that the American design philosophy was superior. The final act of the Hellcat's myth-destroying performance was the shift in Japanese strategy to the kamikaze attacks. The transition from believing in the superior maneuverability of the Zero to embracing suicide tactics was a profound, de facto admission that conventional air superiority had been completely lost. The propaganda shifted from victory through skill to heroism through sacrifice, signaling to the Japanese military, and eventually, the world, that the Hellcat had won the aerial war decisively. The Hellcat had not merely beaten the Zero, it had shattered the foundation of its entire doctrine, exposing the Sons of Heaven myth as a costly illusion and paving the way for the inevitable final assault on the home islands. By the spring and summer of 1945, the Hellcat's role transitioned from general fleet defense to the critical, high-stakes mission of long-range escort for the strategic B-29 Superfortress bombers targeting the Japanese home islands. The massive industrial centers of Tokyo, Nagoya, and Osaka were now within range of American forces, and the B-29 raids required absolute air superiority to operate effectively. While the Hellcat was not designed for the extreme range of the B-29, the U.S. Navy and Marine Corps Hellcats and Corsairs operated from fast carrier task forces positioned off the Japanese coast, providing crucial escort support and target suppression. These final sorties were the culmination of the Hellcat's dominance, flying over territory that had been considered sacred and untouchable just months earlier. The air battles were fierce, though short-lived. The remaining Japanese fighter units, flying a mix of obsolete Zeros, Ki-43 Oscars, and a scattering of newer interceptors like the Ki-84 Frank, were often flown by desperate pilots, lacking the refined training and cohesion of the early war aces. They were no match for the experienced Hellcat squadrons flying with absolute tactical discipline. The Hellcats continued to use their superior high-altitude performance, speed, and heavy armament to devastating effect. The apocalyptic and somber nature of these flights was intense. Hellcat pilots, flying high above the Japanese coast, often had front-row seats to the massive B-29 firebombing raids. They saw the devastating consequences of American air power. Entire districts engulfed in flames, creating massive, dark smoke columns that rose thousands of feet. The primary mission of the Hellcat during these flights was not to seek glory, but to ensure the B-29s survived the gauntlet. Hellcat formations, flying in tight escort, would immediately converge on any Japanese attempt to break the bomber formations, ensuring the superfortresses could deliver their payloads and return safely. The sight of the Hellcats flying unmolested over the Japanese capital was a profound psychological defeat for the Japanese leadership. It proved that the American advance was irreversible and that there were no remaining defensive barriers. The few Japanese pilots who dared to challenge the Hellcat-escorted B-29s were often dispatched in minutes. The Hellcat's final kill, a Zero shot down by Lieutenant J.A. Williams on August 15, 1945, just hours after the surrender order was issued, cemented its status as the aircraft that had seen the conflict through to the very end. The Hellcat left the war as the symbol of overwhelming, final force, having ensured the B-29s could operate at will and confirmed that American air supremacy was absolute, paving the final, fiery path toward Japan's surrender. The final tally of the Grumman F6F Hellcat is a testament to its effectiveness. 5,223 enemy aircraft destroyed, accounting for three-quarters of all U.S. Navy and Marine aerial victories in the Pacific, achieved at an astonishing overall kill ratio of 19-1. The Hellcat's legacy is not built upon breathtaking innovation or aerodynamic perfection, but upon the solid, pragmatic foundation of the Ironworks philosophy: build it tough, make it easy to fly, and ensure the pilot comes home. The Hellcat completely and irreversibly defined modern carrier warfare in three fundamental ways. First, it established pilot survivability as the paramount design criterion. The integrated armor and self-sealing fuel tanks set a new, non-negotiable standard for all future naval fighters. The Hellcat demonstrated that preserving experienced aircrew was more valuable than a marginal increase in speed or turning radius. Second, it enshrined energy tactics as the core doctrine of naval aviation. By dominating speed and climb performance, the Hellcat proved that a pilot could dictate the terms of engagement and avoid fighting to the enemy's strength, maneuverability. Every subsequent U.S. naval fighter was designed with superior engine power and high-speed characteristics, directly following the Hellcat's template. Third, and perhaps most crucially, the Hellcat affirmed the supremacy of American industrial mass production. It was a robust aircraft, designed with simplified construction, making it easy to manufacture, maintain, and repair quickly aboard a carrier. This meant that while the Japanese struggled for months to replace a lost Zero and its veteran pilot, the US Navy could repair a damaged Hellcat in days and put a newly trained pilot into a combat-ready F6F within weeks. The machine became a relentless, sustainable part of the American war machine, an industrial war winner that the Japanese could never match. Though the Hellcat was quickly superseded by the faster F8F Bearcat and the approaching age of jets, its design principles lived on. It provided the tactical blueprint for all modern US Navy carrier operations and confirmed the vital role of the Fast Carrier Task Force as the ultimate projection of power. When restored Hellcats are displayed in museums today, their presence is reflective and powerful. They stand not as beautiful relics, but as symbols of brutal efficiency, the ultimate expression of a fighter designed to perform a singular, necessary task: to establish and maintain absolute air superiority while ensuring the survival of the pilot, thus paving the way for final victory. The Hellcat was not a ballerina. It was a tireless, invincible heavyweight boxer that redefined the rules of the fight and earned its place as one of the most successful combat aircraft in history.